Hey folks, welcome to Last Breath Woodworks. I'm Josh. Now, I know I haven't put out a lot of content the last couple months, and I apologize, but hey, I've been busy. Had to fill the wood shed to heat the house for winter, and probably the biggest project was trying to get my shop slash garage in order because it's been seriously neglected the last couple years due to my health. The good news is I'm feeling better and I think I'm back. Now, in today's project or video, we're going to be making a gift for my mother's fiance. Not only is the gift going to be special, but what we're making it out of is special as well. We're going to be using cherry burls. Now, there's a story behind these as well, and I want to make that clear. I found these on Marketplace a couple months ago, but the guy selling them lived 4 hours away. However, he was willing to deliver them to a city about an hour and a half away. So we set up a meeting and I met with him and picked up 16 beautiful cherry burls, ranging in sizes from little baseball and softball all the way up to these big ones. So if you're watching, Dino, huge shout out to you and thanks for these. They're getting a good home. Now, the big ones aren't quite dry enough to use today, so we're going to be using the small ones, and we're going to be adding a little something special to them to give it a little bit of character, and I think you're all going to love it. So let's get at it. The first thing I had to do was clean these burls up. So I used a chisel, a screwdriver, and a pick to knock off all the loose bark, dig into the little crevices and voids, and clean it all up. Then I just used a wire brush on the drill to scrub them all clean. Then it was over to the bandsaw to rip off or cut off those trunks and branches off of each burl. And since those burls only had characteristic on the outside, not in the trunk, I ripped them all in half so that I could expose all the beautiful character in that wood. So here's the first giveaway. This project is going to be a nut bowl, which means that it's going to go in a round form. So in order to make these little burl pieces fit in there properly, I headed over the belt sander to round off all the faces, and then I also rounded off the ends or edges of each burl so that I didn't have square lines. And now it's time to put all these pieces in the mold. You can see here that the mold I'm using is just another one of those yard sale finds that my wife got for me. It's just an old Tupperware container, and I think she only paid like 50 cents for it. So I really didn't have a hard time using hot glue to put all the burl chunks in place because I knew I'd have to kind of cut and break it away after I was done, and it didn't matter, I can recycle it. It's a one and done kind of thing. Then I put a pine filler block in there so I didn't waste so much epoxy. Now it's time for that special edition I was talking about. And here it is, pistachio shells. Kind of fitting for a nut bowl, don't you think? Then I just started adding those shells in and poked and prodded and pushed them around, added some more, shook the bowl, tapped the sides to get them all to settle in so that they filled all the little spaces between those burls. Then once they were full, I took a scrap piece of plywood with some holes drilled in it so the epoxy would release the air, and hot glued it down to keep those shells from floating up later. Now, here's where this project started going off the rails. I added some green alcohol ink to dye the epoxy because I was trying to make it look like the color green of the nuts to match those shells, but it turned blue. So, in an effort to save it, I added more dye, and it just got worse. So, in a last ditch effort, I added some moss green and bronze gold pigments to try to bring that epoxy back. And believe it or not, it actually worked. Once I poured that epoxy into the mold, I threw it in the vacuum chamber. Now you can see it filled that mold to about a quarter inch above that piece of plywood I had in there. But you can tell by all the bubbling going on in there that it wasn't going to last. I mean, there's a lot of air trapped between all those pistachio shells. So I cycled it on and off to try to suck as much air out as I could for probably an hour and a half to 2 hours. And here you can see it's almost gone. So I mixed up a little more epoxy, poured it in, and cycled it a few more times. Now you can see it's not really full, but I was pretty confident that I had it close, so I just added a little bit more epoxy and then sealed it up and pressurized the pot to 50 psi and let it sit for about 3 or 4 days to cure. Once the piece was cured, I busted it out of that mold and threw the pieces of that mold into the recycling bin and then just screwed a faceplate onto it so I could get it on the lathe. At this point, things were actually looking pretty good. The vacuum chamber did its job. There were no visible air bubbles anywhere. There was no thermal cracking, and the color actually looked decent. So I just started turning away, trying to get this thing into balance, get it round. And I was being pretty aggressive. So what happened next really shouldn't come as a shock or a surprise. You can see here that the epoxy had popped out of some of those pistachio shells, leaving some pretty big voids. But there was still a lot of ghosting or epoxy over those burls, so I knew I had to turn away quite a bit of a material, and I was just crossing my fingers and praying that those voids would disappear. So I took my time and just whittled away lightly because you got the hard and soft parts of the burl, the harder epoxy, and the even harder pistachio shells. I mean, if you've ever eaten them things and you find one that isn't cracked open, you might as well chuck it, because if you try to break it with your teeth, you're going to chip a tooth before that shell breaks. So I fought this thing tooth and nail just to try to get that bowl rounded out and get a pleasing appearance or shape to it. And after all that, there's still a couple of them little voids that didn't disappear, a couple in the Burls that the epoxy never creeped into, but I was bound and determined to fix this and make this work. Now, here's where I caught a lucky break. When I revamped my shop, I put a track on the ceiling and hung shower curtains and flags around my lathe to create kind of a booth or a tent around it, which meant that when those little shards of epoxy popped out of those shells, they hit that curtain and fell straight to the floor, and I was able to pick them up. Now, I just used some CA glue and activator and glued those pieces back into those voids, and in the end, it worked out great. The smaller voids I just filled with CA glue. The bigger ones I used the little epoxy chips in, and the voids in the burl I just used CA and activator. Then I just used a drill to sand all those little chunks down flush, and then sanded the entire outside from 80 to 220 grit. Once it was all smooth, I just pulled the tailstock off and cut a nice mortise in the bottom so that I could flip it around and put it on a chuck. As I started to hollow this thing out, I was overjoyed at how smoothly things were running. But that joy was short-lived because the deeper I dug into this thing, the worse it got. It turned out to be the same battle on the inside as it was the outside. Fortunately, my camera ran out of battery, so I lost a lot of the footage, which is a good thing because there was a cloud of profanity hanging over my shop like a thick fog. Now, before it ran out, you can see here that there's a little strip of that plywood on the outside edge. I left that intentionally because I didn't want to risk burning through that and catching some of those shells and having the lip of my bowl chip out. So when I got it paper thin and the inside done, I just sanded it smooth. Once the piece was hollowed out and sanded completely inside and out to 220, I gave the whole thing a really liberal coating of sanding sealer. This was because those burls had a lot of porous areas in them that the epoxy didn't penetrate, and I wanted to seal those up tight before we went on to the next phase. Then once that sanding sealer was dry, I sanded the whole bowl down with 320 and then 400. And to clean it all up, I just used some rubbing alcohol and a paper towel. You'll see how much debris was actually caught in all those pores. Finally, I just added a good heavy coat of some thick epoxy to seal up all that wood and fill in any little chips or imperfections in the epoxy caused by those extremely hard pistachio shells. After that epoxy had dried overnight, I sanded the whole thing down again from 320 to 800, gave it a couple coats of lacquer to give it a good shine and a hard finish, and it was done. Now, one thing I want to point out here is another downfall to this project, or maybe not, I don't know. You can see that the Burls had a lot more figure on the inside of the bowl than the outside, so I don't know if I should have rounded those out the other way and flipped them when I put this together or not. I guess let me know in the comments what you guys think. Did this turn out well, or was it an epic failure? I don't know. As usual, I'll put some glamour shots up here at the end so you can see the finished product, and let me know what you think. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, anything you can to help my channel grow. And as always, thanks for watching Last Breath Woodworks.